Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So hi, it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Roel Vertigal from Queen's University. He's the, I guess, the director of the Human Media Lab there, and he's been doing a lot of interesting things over the years with display technology. Some of you here know a little bit about that, and in particular, he's going to be talking today about organic user interfaces. I think the thing that impresses me the most about Roel is his very multidisciplinary nature, and some of the conversations I've had with him over the years about many far-ranging topics, going from display technology into, in particular lately, how to evaluate whether or not a particular interactive technology is pleasurable or fun to use. I think these are very interesting topics, and I'm hoping he'll touch on those a little bit. So, without any further delay, I introduce Roel. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Welcome, everyone. So my story begins with the Egyptian monk Cosmas, who in 547 Anno Domini, in his Topographia Christiana, argued that the earth was flat, a parallelogram enclosed by 4 oceans. It should fit the Ark of the Covenant, which was supposedly a parallelogram as well. It comes as no surprise then that the tools we use to see the world greatly affect our worldview. Unfortunately, in about 1,500 years or so, a little less changed. You may think that this is arguably the hottest computing technology. I know I'm speaking at Microsoft. Is the iPhone. But I have news for you. Its user interface is really not that different from, say, the Mac 2 color PC that came out in 1987, except from maybe a couple of multi-touch gestures, but really there are only a couple. Sure, it's a lot flatter. Sure, it's a lot smaller. But flat is the operative word. So if you're looking at Google Maps, for example, one of the issues here is that it's a very, very small screen. So wouldn't it be cool if we had something like this instead? So that's the kind of thing we're shooting for. Foldable displays that can open up real estate when you need them. And of course, the metaphor there is the metaphor that's been used so much in human-computer interaction as the metaphor of the book. So we all know that the Earth didn't turn out to be flat. And just because this monk's tool was flat didn't mean the Earth was. But it required a new tool, one of the earliest information technologies, a tool that in itself was not flat, to change this worldview over the course of about a millennium. The movable type book, which was popularized in the Western world by Johannes Gutenberg. Unlike the scroll, which required linear navigation, book had random access, which was really cool at the time. And those pages carried bits of information that could be easily syndicated, like an RSS feed today, through printing. It was also a key factor in the European Renaissance, which is one of the reasons why we're here today as researchers. It essentially opened up the market for research. However, imagine what it would have been like for a monk to be faced with this first of information technologies, the book. Would it be truly usable? Would there be a help desk for a book?
Ja, så jeg har ikke fått gjort noen ting hele formiddagen. Nei, jeg beklager at det tar tid, så skjønner vi holder på å legge om til et helt nytt system, og da skal alle ha hjelp på en gang. Ja. Så du kommer ikke inn i den, eller? Nei, den bare ligger der. Okay. Har du forsøkt å åpne den? Ja, åpne den? Altså, hvis det hadde vært så enkelt, så hadde jeg jo ikke tilkalt helpdesk, hadde jeg vel? Nei. Vil du ha en kopp varmt vann? Nei, det skal være fort gjort, det skal vi se. Du bare gjør der. Sånn. Ja, da er vi i gang. Ja, altså så langt kom jeg også. Ok. Men så stoppet det opp, og så var jeg redd for at noe av teksten skulle forsvinne, så jeg turte ikke å gå videre. Åja, ok. Nei, men du skjønner at inni her, så ligger det kanskje flere 100 sider med lagret tekst. Så for å komme videre, så tar du tak i et ark, på den måten her, og så liksom blar du over på neste side sånn. Da fortsetter teksten der. Jeg blar, altså? Du blar, ja. Men når jeg skal tilbake da? Ja, da bare blar du tilbake igjen, tar tak der, og så gjør du sånn. Der, så er vi tilbake til den teksten vi hadde, sa. Ikke noe...
Ok, så den slutter der, og så fortsetter den der, ja. Ok, men når jeg skal avslutte for dagen, hva gjør jeg da?
Da bare slår du sammen permene.
Ja?
På den måten der. Sånn. Da er lukket der, ligger alt lagret inni der.
Altså, jeg risikerer ikke å miste noe av teksten her nå.
Nei, alt ligger lagret inni her nå. Ja. I tilfelle du setter fyr på hele greia, det er kanskje lite sannsynlig. Så.
Ja, ok. Nei, for det er noe med det at når du har holdt på med skriftruller,
ja.
så tar det litt grann tid å konvertere til å bla i en bøk. Ja. Ja, det er jo godt heller. Det er greit. Ja, men du, før det går, jeg bare gå gjennom en gang til. Altså, jeg åpner... Ja. Sånn, ja, og så, hva du kalte det?
Blar.
Jeg blar.
Ja, blar videre.
Blar frem og tilbake.
Ja, og
når jeg er ferdig, så bare lukker jeg den.
Nei.
Flott, kjempefint. Ja, men du, vent, ikke sant? Nå er den sånn igjen, nå får jeg ikke åpnet den.
All right, you can watch the full video on YouTube. One of the messages here is that learnability is overrated. You know, if you introduce a technology to an 80-year-old, they're not going to be able to learn it very easily. So one of the things with the graphical user interface is that it got introduced to essentially people that were beyond my daughter's age, who's here in the audience. But my daughter grew up with these technologies, and for her, the GUI is basically writing with a pen. Now imagine that you would teach a 75-year-old to learn how to read or write. You would have a similar challenge. So I think learnability is overrated. However, another message to take home here is that physicality translates into learnability. The idea of picking stuff up, being able to manipulate it in your hands, it living in the real world and it not really being a technology affects the learnability of that technology. So I think we need to put maybe a little bit less emphasis in HAI on learnability and focus on some other things instead. But we'll get to that in a sec. So the book has always been the metaphor for HAI. The first big project in HAI was done by Vannevar Bush in 1945 called mimick, the first mechanical book. It had actually thin film displays, which is really cool. They were the kind that you find on microfilm. So it was a microfilm reader. It was completely mechanized. It was never built because it was impossible. It had a limited form of storage that sort of resembles the way we use the web today. And it directly influenced Doug Engelbart's design of the graphical user interface and the mouse in use today. Another really critical prototype in the history of human-computer interaction is DynaBook, which was done by Alan Kay in 1969. And the thing about this DynaBook, which essentially was the first tablet PC, is that it was never real. It was actually done in cardboard. So what you see here heavily influenced the design of the computer I use today. You can even see the keyboard layout, and some of the fonts are almost identical. The only difference between the MacBook Pro here and DynaBook is that it hinges. But Alan Kay worked for Apple during the time that the PowerBooks were introduced, and so there's a direct lineage back to the DynaBook there. Now, Alan Kay on DynaBook. Another thing we saw in 1968 was a tiny 1-inch square first flat panel display down at the University of Illinois. We realized it was going to be only a matter of years until you could put all the electronics found in the Flex machine on the back of a flat panel display, which I later came to call a DynaBook. Back in 1968, I made this cardboard model, and I thought of it as the machine of the future and started thinking about what it would be like for millions of people to have these machines. So the metaphor became the pencil. What would it be like to have something like this in the world, like pencil and paper? Could people actually use it? And the answer in 1968 and early 70s was no. Now, Alan went on at Xerox to create the Alto, which was the first real graphical user interface, and that led to the Macintosh. So taking paper and taking books as a metaphor is one thing, but we have to recognize that these elements still live in very, very different realms. We have the technology realm of the computer, and it's a virtual realm that's very distinct from the realm of paper, such as here on my desk. Or as P.L. Rollner at Xerox put it, we interact with documents in two separate worlds, the electronic and the physical world, and interaction styles between these two worlds do not resemble each other. And that is one of the chief reasons we still use paper. Abigail Sellon did a book on this topic and concluded that one of the reasons why paper has remained really important is because GUIs are not good at navigation. Input is not on the object. Well, there's at least two people in the audience here who are trying to fix that. One-handed input of a single XY coordinate. Again, we're fixing that with multi-touch. But this notion that you can only move in a single plane in 2 dimensions is extraordinarily limiting when you think about the fact that we have 2 hands and 10 fingers and we can move in 3D. A lack of tactile feedback in motor tasks, which makes it hard to learn certain gestures. And of course, limited screen real estate when you're having overlapping windows. This is particularly an issue with small devices. By contrast, Paper supports multi-touch, annotation while reading, and multitasking, because you can easily mix different documents and put them out in your peripheral vision. So Pierre Wellner realized that and did probably one of the most seminal pieces of work in recent history of HCI, and that's the digital desk. Essentially, the technologies we've been using are very similar to what he's been using. Computer vision for tracking finger movements, projection for projecting on a flat surface on the desk, and then being able to manipulate a digital calculator projected over regular documents on the desktop. You see, I'm not going to run the full video, you see a piece of paper here, and he can circle a number and enter it into his calculator that way. And this was done in 1990. Since then, as I said, multi-touch has evaluated. We now have these cool screens. This is Jeff Hahn's work that allow us to express a lot more dimensions in input, which I think is really important if you want to do creative stuff with computers. We've also seen the evolution of shape in input. This is work by Ravan Balakrishnan and Tovi Grossman on shape tape. The idea being that you can take bending and use it as a direct way of representing a shape, in this case, a 3-dimensional model, which is purportedly a lot more efficient than having to draw this with a mouse. And an evolution of tangible user interfaces. Tangible user interfaces being essentially user interfaces that live in the real world that you can hold in your hand. And this is some early work by Hiroshi Ishii at MIT, trying to devise a clay interface where the 3-dimensional structure of the clay gets sensed by a laser scanner, and then projections get updated accordingly and projected back onto the clay model. And this is what I consider to be probably the world's first organic user interface. This was done in 2002, presented at CHI.
The remaining edges of the work surface are used to project cross-sections.
So we're seeing a landscape analysis model here now that if you depress or change the landscape, the water runs differently over the landscape.
Screencast mode projects analysis functions onto the model. These include variables.
So my little moment was when I saw this display at Polymer Vision about 6 years ago now. That's a Philips spin-off that recently moved to Taiwan. And this is flexible e-ink. So e-ink is the #1 technology that's really, really interesting. And you've all seen the e-book revolution unfolding itself. But this is actual flexible e-ink. And so this is getting really, really close to the kind of paper metaphor that we were originally inspired by. And that led to the formulation of a new kind of user interface, an organic user interface. User interfaces with non-planar displays that may actively or passively change physical shape. So these are user interfaces that really live in the 3-dimensional world. You could wrap them around objects, but you could also treat them as flexible and treat them as paper, in which case you can still bend them, and they would live in the 3-dimensional world in that respect. So I think the quick takeaway message from this talk is that organic user interfaces is going to mean that products will be computers. So here we see a piece of radical design we did using projecting technology. I'll show a video later of sort of the thing that I thought was the most unlike a computer and the most like a product that I could think of, and that was a Coke can. It's a brand. It's not even a drink. It's a brand first. And so we made this interactive. We did this through painting the can with reflective paint and then tracking the can with a Vicon computer vision tracker, and put buttons on it so that you could interact with it in real time, projecting back a 3D model of the can texture mapped with the interactive graphics. And that allowed us to toy around with the idea of what would it be like if we had these kinds of what we call display objects. But what it also means is that industrial design is going to be really, really crucial in the next phase of human-computer interaction. Like graphic designers took over web design, industrial designers will take over the design of most computer interfaces once computer interfaces become integrated intimately with products such as these, or say cereal boxes or other kinds of mundane products we are going to not just need the material expertise and the expertise in form and function that industrial designers have to offer. As technology commoditizes, there will be less of a need for technologists in order to make all this work, and technology will just become one of those things you can use as a material in your design. And the other notion here is that once technology commoditizes, which it's already doing, the only way in which you can differentiate products is through industrial design. And that's nothing new. I stole this slide from Bill Buxton. This is the Kodak Series 3 Pocket Vanity by Walter Dorwin Teague, which was designed in the 1930s as a way of marketing Kodak cameras to a female population. And the way in which this was done was through the industrial design trick of giving it candy colors. And what we see here is that that trick has been replicated at Apple with the iPod Nano, simply coloring things, making it seem more like a fashion article, differentiates your product. And that is definitely something that is in the realm of industrial design. But what I'm proposing is not just this kind of styling, which is rather superficial, but actually integrating the function of a device completely with its user interface such that it only works in limited contexts. So, for example, if you had a product that had a screen integrated, it would only know about the functions of that product, and you wouldn't necessarily use it to check email. Instead, you would have a larger array of various products that have various functionalities, and they would talk to each other and allow you to sort of have this microcosmos of information around you that's hyper-contextualized. All right, before we start talking about organic design principles, first, what it is not. How does this differentiate from the work by Jonathan Ives at Apple, for example? Well, here's a pretty cool design of something called the Barcelona Pavilion, which was done by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, very famous German architect and director of Bauhaus. But it was done in 1930. And so what we're seeing here is very straight lines, very rigid forms, rectangles, wearing the inner on the outer. But in particular, we see rigid and planar devices. This is exactly the kind of aesthetic that we're seeing in properly industrially designed computer products such as Apple's today. And it is an aesthetic very much of the 20th century. It's almost an aesthetic of the 19th century. It's about 100 years old aesthetic. And we've moved beyond that in architecture, and I want to talk to you about that for a little bit. So thinking of devices as devices in and of itself is wrong. When we think of a book is really not a device. It's really not a technology. It's just a thing. And we're designing it as a thing. And that's not just because it's so old. It's also because it's been engineered in such a way that you don't really have to think about interacting with it anymore. It lives totally in the real world. So design aesthetic should not really be equated with engineering efficiency. One of the issues with engineered devices is that they don't age gracefully. And so here we see, does anyone know what this picture is? What building this is? It's Centre Pompidou, designed by Rogers and Renzo Piano. And it gets really dirty after a couple years. And they have to clean the whole thing to make it look new again so that it looks cool again. Yes? It's a museum, but it wears, this literally doesn't just wear its construction inner on its outer, but it wears its plumbing on its outer. And it's really cool, but it gets dirty and then it loses its coolness. It does not age gracefully. So that's a problem with modernist designs, is that the materials really have to be plasticky and shiny all the time. Another thing we need to get rid of is the idea of control or control devices. So the mouse is very much a control device. I use this box and it talks to my computer and it controls an XY coordinate on my screen. Wrong. That's not how humans think. That's not how humans walk. That's not how humans talk. If I have to think in those terms in order to be able to give this presentation, I'd probably be taking 3 hours. So we need to get rid of this notion of control. In a world of 24/7 productivity, we can question this emphasis on efficiency that is sort of comes out of this engineering aesthetic. We don't need to be more efficient. We need to be more creative. And we need to be able to have more downtime and be productive at the same time. Another notion that I think it's not is this idea of cleanliness and youth that's permeating today's society. The idea of not being able to ever grow old and having children at a very late age of 60 or 65, or performing plastic surgery at a very old age in order to continue to look young, is a complete fallacy that we somewhat see reflected in devices such as this iPod, previous generation iPod, which has a really clean design. It's completely white, and its aesthetic is very, very simple in that sense. So those are all aesthetics of the 20th century. They're not aesthetics of the 21st century. They're not postmodern aesthetics. Same is true for the principles of usability. For those of you who aren't familiar with these, Brian Shekel, amongst others, in 1990 formulated 4 principles of usability, the first 2 being learnability. Well, I've already dismissed that one. And the second being efficiency and effectiveness, and I've already dismissed the efficiency part. The effectiveness will remain very important. I personally believe that the goal that you have with using a computer is the most important thing. And if you're a musician, you realize that it might take 10 years for you to learn an instrument. Why would you expend so much time learning an instrument? Well, there's only really one reason, and that's because it allows you to be effective with that instrument, and otherwise you won't be effective. Well, we haven't really been designing computer systems for that kind of expert use other than in the military. So that's an interesting notion. But efficiency? Well, I think we're already extremely efficient, and I think we have other things to think about, such as the other 2 remaining principles, which are very ill-defined. Flexibility. Nobody really knows what Shekel meant by that. One interpretation is that users can change around and customize their user interface. We don't really know how to evaluate that. You can have people customize or not customize and measure how efficient they are, but that really doesn't seem to capture the spirit. Could we start digging a little bit deeper and truly think about flexibility in terms of, for example, the flexibility of clothing and the functionality shape-shifting that occurs there? If I, for example, wear my clothing, the clothing is flexible enough to fit my body. However, if I want to store it, it folds up neatly in a small volume. That is really cool. Satisfaction, finally, and this we talked about a little bit this morning, Andy and I, is something that's extremely hard to measure. Knowing that some interaction is satisfactory, we all know the feeling, and that's maybe why we buy Apple products, but we really don't know what it means. We really don't know what it means, and we really don't know how to measure satisfaction very, very well. But there seems to be something engaging about certain designs that other designs don't have. And it's almost this intangible property that industrial designers seem to know how to capture very well. All right, so let me ask this question. Now, obviously, this is a rune. But is it more or is it less? Let's not think about this too long. How many hands for more? Okay, we got 2 hands for more, 3 hands for more. How many hands for less? We got 2 hands for less, so we kind of have a split. We got a couple of non-voters. Well, there's a couple of arguments for saying it's less. Well, it used to be a completely functional building and people would use it, so it's no longer that, so that means it's less. But then why do tourists flock to buildings like this? And that's because in terms of aesthetics, it's more. This building is actually in many ways prettier than the original building because now it has moss over it, it's got these really high information entropy, it's got a really cool aesthetic that's quite rough. Yet this aesthetic is not captured at all by any of the computer devices we have today. And in fact, in today's society, it is not valued at all. Now, there are other societies where that's not true. So in the States, they would probably throw this out as a misbaked piece of pottery. In Japan, they would pay $10,000 for it. The art of subtle imperfection is a concept known as wabi-sabi in Japan. It means sad beauty, and it finds profundity in nature, accepting cycles of growth, decay, and death. It's simple, just like the modernist design, but in a very different way. It's simple in its earthiness, in its simple, slow, uncluttered authenticity. So it's aged wood, not pergo, rice paper, not glass. It celebrates cracks and crevices and other marks of time, weather and loving use leave behind. It reminds us that we're all transient beings and that this planet, as well as our bodies, only exist in the material world for a limited amount of time. Through wabi-sabi, we learn to embrace rust, frayed edges, and the march of time they represent. Now, it's no coincidence that the young architect Frank Lloyd Wright, one of the greatest architects America's ever known, once studied, lived, and worked in Japan. He built the Imperial Hotel there in Tokyo in the 1920s, which is now destroyed, but came back as a transformed being. He never really advertised what he learned in Japan, but instead coined the term organic architecture to articulate many of the aspects of wabi-sabi and the balance between humans and the environment they create, as well as nature. So Frank Lloyd Wright in 1939 coined the term organic architecture like so. And this sounds really crazy, but this is a direct paraphrase. So here I stand before you preaching organic architecture, not cherishing any preconceived form, fixing upon us either past, present, or future, but instead exalting the simple laws of common sense or supersense, if you prefer, determining form by way of the nature of materials. A well-known example of this kind of architecture is Falling Water, perhaps the most famous piece of postmodern architecture in the world. Now, Wright had many choices to place this house on the land, but he asked and interviewed the family, and they said, well, we really like the waterfall. Now, what they meant was we really like the view of the waterfall, but instead, he thought it would be a nice engineering challenge to place the house right on top of the waterfall, which is what he did. But in doing so, he created a masterpiece. Why? Because he managed to perfectly balance the cantilevered aesthetics of mankind, these concrete striations here, with the flows of nature that literally go into the rock. He used natural rock for this pillar, and so balancing the aesthetics of mankind with the flows and aesthetics of nature in an almost perfect sense. And this got picked up by what's called the Gaia Charter for Architects. I won't go into Gaia. It has to do with earth balance, but it's a really, really interesting charter that was devised by David Pearson in 1989. He's an organic or a sustainable architect. And he said architecture should be inspired by nature and be sustainable, healthy, conserving, and diverse. It should unfold like an organism from the seed within. It should exist in a continuous presence and begin again and again. It should follow the flows and be flexible and adaptable, satisfy social, physical, and perhaps most of all spiritual needs, grow out of the sight and be unique, and celebrate the spirit of youth, play, and surprise. This does not negate what I said earlier. I don't think there's anything wrong with being youthful and playing at an old age. I just think there's something wrong with faking it. And to express the rhythm of music and the power of dance. All right, so being a scientist, I thought that was kind of, fluffy. So I took that and translated it into a couple of design principles for organic user interfaces. First of all, it means that input devices should be output devices, and I apologize for even using the term devices here. Input equals output. If we want to live in the real world, then whatever effect we have on the real world should be directly on the artifact. And that means that if we have an input device, it really cannot be disassociated from the output device. And in a simple means, that means touchscreens. But it goes a little bit beyond that. Display shape and deformation, for example, can be used as a source of input. Secondly, form follows flow. And this stems directly from designs like Falling Water. Form may follow any physical shape found in the natural environment. That means we can create computers in any shape or form now. They should also mimic the flexibility of those materials, including being able to unfold and to move according to, for example, the physiology of the human, which is a really important ergonomic principle. They should also flow around activities, allowing better use of multiple devices during multitasking, and create continuous fluid experiences that are imbued with physics rather than creating binary experiences that are sometimes hard to follow. And finally, and this again comes from Frank Lloyd Wright, form does not follow function. That was actually coined by his mentor, Sullivan, as a modernist idea. Form follows function means you can reduce all embellishments and just create whatever is functional. And this is what America is built on. What Frank Lloyd Wright proposed is that form equals functions. The two are integrally related and they cannot go without each other. And when we're talking about user interfaces, software user interfaces, the form is somewhat disassociated from the function because it's flat. But if we have these user interfaces running on a three-dimensional shape, then of course the shape of that object is going to affect the user interface, the software user interface, as well as its utility, very, very intimately. So that means physical affordances are going to make a comeback. Being able to feel what the function of an object is going to be really, really important. It also means that we can begin designing for a different kind of activity. And I'm talking about things like creative activities, where very often you need to manipulate objects, but also social and spiritual activities, and to have a certain physicality in your interactions. I'll get back to what I mean by the spiritual in a sec, because that still sounds pretty ephemeral. So input equals output, I've already shown you an example of that. This is one form of input equals output. Form equals flow, and this is something I hate my iPhone not having. This ability to shapeshift. Does anyone have a clamshell phone here? No? Everybody has an iPhone? I take it. Just kidding. Well, what's really cool about clamshell phones is that you can open them up, and that actually communicates. It's a great affordance for opening up communications. But it also unfolds so that you can hold it against your head, and it follows the shape of your head as you do so. So the microphone ends up here, and the speaker ends up over there. What's even cooler is that when you close it, not only do you close the communication channel, but you protect the keypad as well as the display from any disruption in the environment, from scratches, etc. So this is exactly what I mean by physical affordances, but also by form following the flow of your activity. When you're on the phone, you open it up, form changes, close it, boom. Now, here's a design by Karim Rashid that's really interesting in this regard. This is just a soap bottle, okay? It's not even a computer. But what we're seeing here is that one of the issues of soap bottles is that when they're almost empty, you have to put them upside down, right, to squeeze that a little bit out. And so Karim redesigned the soap bottle and thought, well, why don't we put the bottle upside down to begin with? And now all I need to do is pick it up like so. It folds around the hand, and I can squeeze it. And this is a perfect example of form equals function. Unfortunately, it didn't end up, I do think it was productized. It ended up coming off the store shelves, and now they have this, and I'm happy to say this on video, terrible design that doesn't stand up on its upside down because it'll just keel over. It also doesn't squeeze very well. The reason was, I believe, that this design was too expensive to produce. But this design is absolutely brilliant, I believe.
Why is the second one good?
Well, I actually got this from a webpage, and it already said that, so I don't necessarily subscribe to that. But it's interesting to see the dynamics of the shape here going from somewhat more rectangular to a more of a body shape. And I do think that that communicates this idea of fitting to the body. Picking that bottle up requires very little energy, whereas picking that bottle up, first of all, you need to fit your hand around it, which is hard to do, and then you have to tilt it like so. All right, so here's my summer office. This is my backyard in Kingston, just north of Kingston, Ontario. And I'm not just showing you this to show off. This was actually the environment that another very famous architect grew up in and probably got inspired by. Frank Gehry, Canadian architect, who's very famous for this particular building, which transformed the city of Bilbao from somewhat rusty industrial wasteland to a tourist attraction. And that's what I mean by designing for spirituality. Here, he designed a building that probably doesn't even hold paintings very well, because nothing in the building is rectangular. Okay? What he designed was a landmark that transformed an entire city using one building. That's spiritual design. That's thinking bigger than the actual function of the architect or of the architecture. What's also interesting here is that this is actually a very high-tech building because it mimics some of the shapes that you find in nature. All these curves are created as NURB surfaces in his special software that really is the key to his success. Being able to do finite element modeling of the strains and stresses that are placed on these surfaces has been a key to make these buildings happen. And so we're looking at a $300 million building right there. But to mimic nature is a high-tech endeavor. It's not a low-tech endeavor. Now, a much older example of how computers can integrate into shapes that are non-flat and into buildings and create skins for buildings is, of course, the NASDAQ display, which is literally a skin around a building, and probably one of the first examples, not just of a display integrated into an architecture, but also a display that is non-flat and very, very large. All right, brief word about the technology. We've already seen this polymer vision rollable display. It uses e-ink on a flexible substrate. The challenge here is to actually print the circuitry right on a flexible substrate, which is easy to break. The e-ink itself is pretty robust. Here's how it works. For those of you who don't know, you polarize a plate just like you do with an LCD display, and then you have polarized ink capsules that either repel or attract based on the polarization. If you want gray, you basically do a neutral, and you'll get a gray mix of ink capsules. The big downside of this technology is that it's very slow. The big pro is that it consumes very little electricity when not changed, because it's just ink, and it'll just stay in its current form. So this is the biggest piece of vaporware in the history of flexible computing, at least. This is the polymer vision radius, which I actually can, you have to believe me, I held in my hand in a fully operative form in 2005. And it hasn't made it to market for various reasons. But it is a really interesting example of how you could have a display that rolls and unrolls, and thus creating screen real estate when you need it, yet a small form factor when you don't need it. Here's another technology that's going to make this happen, and that's flexible OLEDs. This is a SONY prototype. You could easily imagine this wearing a wristband, something like this, around your on your clothes or as an armband. And this is completely flexible technology. This is currently at the state where the LCD was when Alan Kay saw it. Okay, so I'm not predicting that this is going to be everywhere immediately. However, many of these technologies have come out a couple of years ago now, so I'm confident to say within the next 5 to 10 years we will see products. And in fact, we're already seeing some products come out, and I have an example later. Right now, we're still focusing on rigid surface screens. This is, however, very, very much like paper. We see here a cardboard piece of machinery that actually is a computer. This is the Plastic Logic e-ink pad that was introduced last year, and it is in fact a computer. So it does sense touch, and this is their entry into the ebook reader market. It recently got introduced at CES, I believe, in a somewhat different form. But what I really like about this form factor, it really looks like paper. The only problem is it does not flex yet. And I believe that that's not necessarily because they can't do it. There are other reasons for that I won't get into. Here's one piece of technology we have been able to lay our hands on. It's Philips LumaLive. It's a pillow that you can stick underneath your shirt, and then you have an a display on your shirt. It's fairly high res. It's about, I don't know, 128 pixels or so. And you can actually show messages on there. And I'll show an example of a little experiment we did with Philips LumaLive last summer. So there are a number of technologies coming out that will make this happen. However, many of them have pros and cons in terms of their sustainability. And I just wanted to mention that when we speak of Gaia, we need to speak of sustainability. One really cool notion is that if we can actually wrap flexible displays around products, is that we'll have displays in computers everywhere. However, if we don't do it the right way, we won't be able to recycle them. Imagine the horror of having a display on every Coke can. And Esquire magazine actually already made that mistake in 2008, I believe. They came out with a flexible e-ink screen, and it was just a banner that basically yelled. It had 3 pixels that were printed as words, and it yelled, buy me, essentially. And there was no way to recycle that. Instead, what they should have done is they should have canceled the print subscription and go onto the Kindle instead. That would have been a radical move that would actually have been beneficial to the environment. And the reason, of course, is that these e-ink screens potentially use less electricity when reused. Okay? So Kindle is great because you keep using the same device for different content. And of course, it also means you don't need to cut trees for paper. It also means you don't have to use gas in order to ship bits over atoms. So there are a bunch of reasons why this is potentially a green technology. However, if we don't get it right, it'll fail as a green technology. And the key there is reusability, not recyclability. This technology will be very hard to recycle. It'll be very easy to reuse. So if we focus on manufacturing products that can be reused over and over and over and over again, then that means we can actually make a contribution to the environment by delivering bits where normally atoms would be shipped. So an example of that is, for example, having a flexible screen that you would use in the morning to read your e-newspaper, and in the evening you might read a magazine on it instead. And of course, that's very good for the environment. All right, now a couple of examples of some of the things we've done and some of the things other people have done. This is fairly limited. I'm mostly focusing on what we've done. There are three categories of organic user interfaces. The first is the flexible form factor. The second is the rigid non-planar form factor. And the final is a programmable form factor. And I see that very much as a thing of the future. So first, flexible form factors. This is a concept mock-up of a credit card display that could be used as a map. It got prototyped as a rigid screen with a bendable acrylic called Gummi by SONY in 2004 by Karsten Schresik and Ivan Poparev. And the idea was that you could bend to zoom in onto a map, bend out to zoom out of that map, and then you could use back of the device touchscreens in order to move around. That same year, we did a system called PaperWindows to sort of push back and see like how far can we push the envelope in terms of interaction techniques if we actually had really paper displays, really thin film paper displays. And we did that by capturing, using a very expensive Vicon motion capture system, 9 markers on pieces of paper, and then fitting a NURB surface through that, texture mapping it, projecting that back onto the display or onto the paper. And of course, that means that pixels which would be enlarged because of the shape of the paper and the way the projected light interacts with that fold get pre-shrunk in the 3D model and then enlarged again when you actually project them on the paper. And that basically takes care of all skewing problems. So you can take any shape and pretend that it's a real piece of paper. And it really gives a very interesting feel. The experience that I had when I was using the system was that of using a leaflet. And what you're seeing here instead is browsing through web pages, going back and forth by rotating the piece of paper.
So Dave, I hear you have a web page.
Johnny Lee replicated, who works at Microsoft now, replicated this work at CMU a couple of years ago, where he used a $20 device to do the same thing. This is a Wiimote that he, basically using active markers, used to create this foldable newspaper.
This format is a large sheet that has been folded in half twice. This allows the user to customize their desired viewing area from half a page to viewing 2 full pages.
So here we see an example of increasing screen real estate with real ease, and yet keeping it in a foldable, pocketable format.
If the user decides they want to reduce the viewing area, they simply fold the display in half again.
And he also had fan-shaped devices. Here's a piece of work we did about 2 years ago, recently got published at TEI. The notion that board games are really a very fun and sociable family activity, but we're seeing computer games take over this world, and mom might be playing behind her computer, and the kid might be playing with her iPod Touch or whatever it might be. Wouldn't it be fun if we could integrate the two worlds and have displays that actually are active on cardboard? And so what we see here is a cardboard Settlers of Catan game piece. What's cool about that game is it's actually a reconfigurable board made out of hexagonal tiles. And we're tracking these tiles with little tiny IR markers and then projecting a real-time strategy game on it so that we can have the best of both worlds. We can sit around the table, construct these huge tessellated screens that have full gaming content. But what it also means is that we can actually use physical interaction techniques in order to interact with the characters, such as, for example, pouring information from one tile to the next. So here we see a sort of a liquid motion, just to demonstrate the idea.
Here we have very natural pouring from one tile to another. this can be used in combination.
And the way that could be used in a game, for example, is pouring troops onto a village, or in this case, we connect, the ship moves one tile, and then we take the tile and pour the troops that are on the ship out on the beach. Now, of course, you can also do all sorts of regular things with this that we're used to in GUIs, such as, for example, being able to pop up a context or a marking menu or something like that. Here's actually the Esquire magazine flexible display. It was the first flexible e-ink display that we laid our hands on in the lab. Here we're seeing a bending gesture that was done with a bend sensor and an Arduino to scroll through the information, which in this case is just 3 lines, 3 pixels that are pixelated words, essentially. But we're now moving towards making this a reality, going from a projected interface to real flexible screens that, for example, have these kinds of interaction techniques in order to be able to page through them. So what you're seeing here is bookmarking. I'm going to run that again. What we're seeing here is paging down on one side, paging up on the other, using bend sensors. And then the user creates a bookmark, which gets placed, and then he navigates bookmarks using an earmarking gesture. One of the interesting things about this is that we're going to see a very different way of interacting with flexible screens than we do with rigid screens, and that's because there's no normal force with flexible screens. So if you press a button on a flexible screen, the button doesn't push back, and that means it can be very hard to actually depress with any kind of force unless you hold your hands behind the screen. And that means you always have to hold the screen in a certain way in order to be able to depress. Now, of course, capacitive touchscreens are problematic because you get spurious interactions all over the place when you roll these things up or when you stick them in your pocket. And so that's one of the reasons why we think that bending is actually a very good solution for navigating, other than the fact that we're all used to this. When we read books, we're used to sticking our fingers in between pages, putting physical bookmarks down. And so there's a lot of transfer that you get from that. And our initial evaluations show that this actually decreases the mental load with regards to paging as compared to, for example, push-button navigation page up and down interfaces. Here's another flexible display technique that was projected. This is work by Julian Lipinski, who now works with Ravan Balakrishnan, where he was interested in surgical operating theaters and trying to support imaging right on the body. And so here we have a flexible display that's projected on. It's a piece of textile, so it could be a surgical piece of textile. You project the images right on the patient, and you use gestures over the flexible display. So this is not actually touching the display. This is hovering over the display in order to peel image data so that you can look inside the human being. Here's another example of the same technology where he takes a reusable textile form factor, places it on a cereal box. So this means the cereal box itself doesn't need to necessarily have a display. Not every cereal box needs to have a display, but you can still create an interactive experience with that cereal box because the textile form factor basically takes on the form factor of the underlying object, and now it becomes an interactive cereal box, and you can read up your ingredients. And this is a piece of LumaLive that I was talking about earlier. We are very interested in multi-touch on these kinds of form factors, and of course the problem is that you can't necessarily do multi-touch on somebody else's body, and so we're really interested in finding out where can you touch and where can you not touch. And this is a social touch experiment that we're conducting right now, and it turns out that that experiment actually hasn't been done in social science. All these experiments have actually been done with questionnaires instead, because everybody's toeing around this notion of being able to touch for real. But I think it's really important to do this experiment for real. And of course, the initial results suggest that the shoulder pads are the best place to put this kind of sensor. Yes?
What's the context of being able to touch someone else to control a display?
Well, you could imagine using a... so here we're seeing the tapping action. I'm just going to replay that. Let me play that one more time. When I give Andrews friendly tap on the shoulder, it's going to move to the next image. So I'm browsing images here. And of course, I can keep doing that. Now, you could, of course, imagine using a remote control or a cell phone in order to interact with somebody else's shirt. But there are obvious issues there in terms of privacy and how to manage connections. How do you set up a Bluetooth connection with somebody else's shirt? And do I want you to change my content? So what's really cool about being able to touch is that the person is standing right in front of you if you don't want them to touch. There are several ways which we have evolved over the years to make sure that that doesn't happen.
I think what Rick is alluding to is there an application where that makes sense?
I guess is there an application or just, a lot of the stuff you show me is just great. I kind of, I grok it, right? I understand why you might want the serial box to tell me about this stuff. I haven't seen these displays before, so I don't know the context, but to me it seems like, I could see myself wearing that to kind of signal to the world something about myself. But why would I want somebody else to affect what I'm showing? I kind of am missing the scenario.
Well, one interesting idea is that you want to customize or explain a relationship, for example. So let's say you and a potential girlfriend are in a disco, and your girlfriend wants to find an icon or a picture or something like that that sort of signifies the relationship. Then being able to use touch on each other is actually a very appropriate mechanism in order to change the content of the screen. Now, I can, of course, imagine that there are many other scenarios. I can, of course, imagine all the other ways of interacting as well. But this is a particularly intimate way of interacting that's really interesting, is because we don't actually do this. So it's a great example of things we don't do with computers that maybe we should consider doing with computers, and we'll figure out what happens next.
Maybe you could just sit to change the language of translation, and get to French.
So the second category is rigid non-planar form factors, and here we see the first iPod. Sorry to keep talking about Apple. I didn't really mean to do that, but I kind of have to. This was a piece of styrofoam with no display. It's really difficult to evaluate this early on with users because you have to put them behind a computer to show them the software interface. So there are lots of reasons why you'd want to prototype in styrofoam. And really, there's no computer support for that. So we did a project called Display Objects, where we took the same kind of technology we used in PaperWindows, but instead of having to draw these interfaces on these styrofoam objects, you simply project the user interface on there. And what's really interesting about that notion is that you can start thinking that hardware really isn't important anymore. If any object can be your hardware, then really the functionality becomes a software downloadable item. So instead of, oops, there goes my power. Okay, so here we see an iPod being projected on this piece of styrofoam. And now I can actually pick it up, and it's just a piece of styrofoam, but it has all the functionality of an iPod. So I can customize, flexibly change the layout of anything. And then when I hit the green button, it turns into sort of play mode. And now it's a fully functional iPod. And of course, you can do the same thing with the same device and change it into an iPod Touch or into a BlackBerry or whatever your fancy is. And so you can imagine a future of display objects that have displays on all sides that have sufficient power to do the functionality that you want from the device, and you just download the functionality from a store. Hello? Okay. And this is already happening. This is a Samsung camera that came out recently that actually has displays all over the place. Now, we've also been dabbling in spherical displays. This was, again, a Vicon Track $20 Toys R Us Globe. And, of course, Benko did a much better job at that with the Microsoft Sphere, which was done in 2008. And here, and again, an interesting question is, what do we actually need this for? So we built a bigger sphere, trying to figure that out. And one of the interesting things about spheres is that not only are they sociable in the sense that you can stand opposite each other and work together on stuff, they're also really cool for certain navigational tasks, such as, for example, browsing information that's inherently spherical, such as Google Earth here. It also squeezes a lot of pixels into a very small space. So you actually have about twice the space requirements for a regular display. This is a similar kind of display, but here is the Coke can. So this is actually an interactive cylindrical display. This is, again, projected, but from the exterior, not from the interior. So we're seeing what that might look like someday. Coke cans would be full of commercials. I dread that day. Finally, programmable matter. This notion of displays that can actually actuate in the environment and change shape. So one early example of that was Lumen by Ivan Poparev at Sony. But really, this is still very much a pipe dream of the future. And what we're seeing here is the Claytronics project at CMU, which promises a world in which we have these displays that are real reality, three-dimensional displays, where tiny little robot pixels climb on top of each other, and they have LEDs or whatever the technology might be to give you a hands-on three-dimensional experience. And right now they're working on sort of the smart dust level. A lot of the problems are actually theoretical computer science. How can you build a structure like that and move a hole through it without, while maintaining structural integrity? How do you communicate with that many nodes of pixels, et cetera, et cetera? These are interesting challenges that guys like Jeff Goldstein are trying to address. So with that, I wanted to wrap up, concluding that here ends the tyranny of the task and of the device, and begins design for the human organism. Natural high-tech materials that use form for input as well as display, and designs that flow with our activities that serve more than just productivities. In organic user interfaces are industrial designs. Input equals output, form equals flow, and function equals form. And if you want to read up on that, please check out the communications of ACM special issue on this topic, edited by Ivan Poparev and myself. I believe it's June 2008. And you can learn more about what people are doing in this realm. And of course, I would like to invite you to visit our webpages, humanmedialab.org, for a live blog and all the stuff that we're up to. All right, so I survived my battery crisis. And I would like to open up the floor for some questions. Sorry, if you thought this talk went pretty fast, that was because I was aware of the battery issue.
Sorry, what did you say the website was?
humanmedialab.org.
It's right up there.
Yeah, it's right there. Organicui.org also, by the way, gives you all the content of the communications of ACM articles.
So, I have a question.
Yeah.
So on one side, you argue for, I think, simplicity of having forms that are completely, the form itself senses, has all the sensors built in and all the display capabilities built in, so you can assume any function. Then on the other side, you're arguing how throughout human evolution, there's all these forms that have specific purpose, and the form itself is so integral to the purpose. I'm not really seeing how those two ideas merge.
Does anyone have a BlackBerry here?
I think I can.
Or another phone, say?
Sure.
Yeah. So how are these two different? They're just made by different manufacturers. So if I want to change my Samsung into this kind of iPhone, all I really should be doing is going to the Apple Store and downloading the iPhone app onto this hardware. So I'm saying, like, yes, you're right. We need different form factors. I won't steal that. We need different form factors for different functions, but we don't need different form factors for similar functions. But we may need different software skins or different applications. And in fact, the App Store is an example of that already, where you can change the functionality of your device.
I'm more thinking about the input part of that problem. So if you have, one of the nice things about specific forms is that they're very highly optimized for a particular input.
Yes.
And when you go to these nondescript blob forms, nothing wrong with them, but you tend to resolve inputs through kind of suboptimal ways. I would argue.
Yeah, no, I'm not arguing against that. I'm just saying that there is a space within this design space, which is huge, for having software-only functionality that when you have a display wrapped around the entire device, anything that has that does well in a form factor that's a brick could be downloaded onto that thing, and then that thing would have accelerometers, it would have multi-touch interaction, it would have all these GPS, whatever you can think of, already pre-built in there, so that when you need to be able to use a different kind of interaction modality for that particular app, you can. With Google Maps, I might be using my GPS. I don't use my GPS for the mail tool. So I think that really represents the kind of flexibility in changing hardware into software, and it addresses a really important concern of mine, and that is that we keep buying new cell phones, and they all look the same. They all have the same basic functionality, and we keep buying new cell phones. And one major reason is, in fact, what I'm proposing. It's industrial design. It's fashionable to have the latest, greatest gear, not necessarily because it's better, because a phone is a phone is a phone. If I can talk to someone, I can talk to someone, right? It's because it has, the Prada diamond, or it has this or that. Well, why don't we just make that a software option? And that actually allows us to mitigate some of the risk of increasing consumerism through design. Does that address your question? I'm not necessarily. I'm actually proposing that we have different form factors for different kinds of functionalities, but that's not to say that the brick won't be one of those form factors, and then you can do stuff within the brick.
You can have a small brick or a large brick.
Exactly. And let's call it the iPad. Sorry, you had a question.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting when you were prototyping with projected prototypes basically on surfaces, projecting onto surfaces.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether there was a certain, whether you tested the extremes of surfaces people would be willing to interact with, right? Like, did you ever project on water and see if people were like, ooh, liquid display is interesting?
Yeah, actually, I might, if my computer will allow me to.
Because in some ways I wonder whether that's what constraining our options is, what users are willing to, or...
No, yeah, I disagree with that notion. I think that users are willing to put up with a lot more if we were to offer them more. I don't think there is a very diverse ecosystem in computing devices at all. No, that was it. Yeah, there isn't really too much choice at all. I mean, basically everything we have is either that form factor or the form factor and it's either large or small, and that's about it. There's some diversity, please. And then we can pick and choose, I'm not sure it was still on camera, but apparently, purportedly, one of the reasons why a plastic logic display is not flexible is because they thought that users wouldn't like it. Because flexible displays are hard to interact with, but I believe that they're not necessarily hard to interact with. They're hard to interact with if you use the wrong kind of interaction modalities. So I think that that's really more of a problem, is how do we match the kind of sensors that you need for that kind of technology with the kind of form factors that you need. If you get that wrong, you have to get everything right in these designs. And I think that's a little bit different from the kind of design we're used to today, where we can make a lot of mistakes because we're fairly limited to what we can do and it's all planar. People are fairly forgiving because they think of it as a technology. Once you start thinking of something as a soap bottle and you can't squeeze soap out of it, people toss it in the bin, and that's the last time they bought your product. So you have to really get these kinds of mappings right, I think. And to me, that actually sounds like a challenge for human-computer interaction. It also means better usability, because there'll be an ecosystem of products that work and products that don't work, that get bought or not get bought. So yes, I'm arguing for diversity.
I have another question.
Yeah.
With respect to displays that are of shapes that are kind of non-flat or non-traditional, I mean, I even consider flexible displays particularly being planar, except that they're kind of, bent in many ways. But with one of the experiences that I had with spherical display, for example, is that it almost calls for a completely different kind of data.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, most of the data that we have available right now is not well suited for non-planar displays. So have you thought about the suitability of what items are really suitable for some of these non-traditional displays?
We have, and we have had some problems justifying the need of a spherical display, other than the functions that I just mentioned. There are some really cool things you can do with, for example, art pieces where you have particle systems floating around the displays. There's cool stuff, but the photo sorting app doesn't quite cut it. It's much better for a flat screen. So we actually took the opposite stance now, and we're trying to actually prove in an experiment that spherical displays are no different from flat displays. It's just that their surface is larger and you can't see the other side. And in the case of a large screen like we have about this size, a computer or a display, you can't even see the other person. There are, however, instances that we're not looking at in this particular experiment that would be very interesting to observe, and that is when people move over or around the display, and maybe you've seen that happening, where you can sort of have your own private space and I can have my own private space, but there's sort of this in-between area where we could share information, and I think that's a really interesting area for study, where with flat screens, essentially everything is public all the time. And so we're doing a task in both a collaborative and a competitive environment and see how that impacts performance. When you can see what somebody else is doing and when you cannot see what somebody else is doing. But essentially it's like a flat screen with a curtain in between.
On the other hand, you know, if you have a dome projection, there's a heck of a lot more data than there was just a couple of years ago. That's true.
Yeah, but a lot of it will probably involve browsing, right? Or browsing like data sets, yeah. So that is a good example of what you can use this for.
So there's a lot more omnidirectional data than there ever was.
Yeah, so a great example of sort of the complexity of dealing with sphere interactions is zooming in onto an Earth when it becomes flat. And so then the sphere should actually be flat, because the data becomes flat when you zoom in. But then when you hit the street level, you can get these street views, and they're great for spherical displays because they're omnidirectional like that. So it's kind of like a fractal, which kind of is cool because that relates to what I was saying about organic architecture and sort of like, you know, begin again and again. You see those kinds of features come back where the form factor starts interacting with the data in really intricate ways. But no, I don't necessarily have a solution for that. I'm happy to take either side of the fence. Say like, you know, spherical displays are the greatest thing on Earth, and here's what we use them for. On the other side, I could say, you know, there's really nothing you can do with a spherical screen that you can't do with a flat screen. I don't know.
I do have one question.
Okay.
CES this year?
Yeah.
The dominant presentations were around 3D televisions.
Yeah.
Couldn't walk 10 feet without seeing one.
Yeah.
And that's obviously a three-dimensional image, but within a two-dimensional kind of projection system, limited interaction. Do you think that potentially is going to help this type of thing?
I think it's a bit of
type of thing, or
yeah, I think it's a bit of a fad.
Okay.
They really try to push beyond HD TV. Like, okay, yeah, cool, we just sold a whole bunch of new TVs to everybody, but now the market is saturated. What else can we do? And so they came up with 3D, mostly I think by lack of other ideas. Okay. I think the Wii and interactivity is much, and the kind of stuff that Annie does is much more interesting. That said, I do think that there's a space for 3D. We are working on some of those things. I do think that screens will eventually become 3D, but there are many problems, such as, you know, what do you do in multi-user situations, and you want to have a viewpoint that's different from somebody else's. You know, lenticular screens address that to some extent, but not really. And so once you're really talking about an ecosystem of users, multiple users, 3D kind of sucky. So I'm not sure. I think it's a bit of a fad. I don't think it'll go away, though.
Okay.
It's not transient. But that's why everybody's talking about it. Next CES, they'll be talking about something else.
4K. Resolution.
Yeah, no.
4K, 3D.
Yeah.
No, 4D.
Exactly.
Displays that tickle you.
Move through time.
Yeah. No, they do. No, they got these 4D experiences now in IMAX and stuff where you get sprayed on and, you know, rumble seats and stuff.
That's nice.
So, all right.
Cool. Let's thank you all.
Yeah, pleasure.